And then people always say that, well, what do I do? What do I do now? And I think the best thing you can do is explain to people what's going on. And explain, we've always said you need to explain what value you bring to the transaction. Now you got to continue to do that. You see, prior to this, we didn't really have to sell our benefits to the buyer, because what allowed us to get compensated on the buy side was the fact that somebody took a listing on the sell side. They took a listing on the sell side, they put it in the MLS and the sell side contract, and the MLS made sure anybody that brought in a buyer got paid. And it didn't even matter whether the person that brought in the buyer on the buy side got their license yesterday or 20 years ago, whether they were experienced or not experienced, whether they worked hard in the transaction or didn't work hard in the transaction, they all got paid the same thing. There also is a misalignment of interests on the compensation structure. And the misalignment of interest is the higher the sale price, the more commission both agents get. And so even if you're representing the buyer, there's a misalignment, because the higher the price, the more commission you got paid. Now, nobody's going to blow a deal, or we know this, over, a couple $1,000s in a purchase price. Nonetheless, there's not an alignment. And the Department of Justice doesn't like that. And then there's something called steering, which actually kind of makes sense from a common sense point of view. And steering was, if you're not offered enough commission, you won't show the property. And the department, and they couldn't prove this, but that's what they're saying, right? That if you put, and that they actually said that sometimes agents of the seller would say to the seller, to convince the seller to offer that buy side commission at a higher amount, is if you don't offer enough, other agents aren't going to show it. And if they don't show it, you don't get the exposure. Now, we already said you didn't really need the exposure in the market that we've been living in the last couple of years, right? All you had to do is a couple people hear about it, spreads, everybody's looking for, it's really a seller's market. And even in a seller's market, commission on the buy side did not come down. And that's not what the Department of Justice and the FTC was looking for. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And if you're practicing today, I think you continue to practice the way you're practicing. You make sure you disclose to sellers that they don't have to pay commissions. You give them all of the reasons why it's important, but you don't say that if you don't offer the commission, nobody's going to show your house, right? Because that plays right into the hands. That's steering. And because if in fact it's true on the buy side, it's steering. And that's part of this whole case, all of these cases as well. So it is big news. The money is big money. I think it has the potential to dramatically change the way people offer compensation in real estate transactions. There will be ways developed to transact around this, I believe. People say, well, the buyers aren't going to have the money to put the money up. I think so. No, the lenders aren't going to allow it to be financed on the buy side. I think that the lending world is going to play. They're in this with everybody. See, lenders want to make loans, and the secondary money market wants to be able to buy those loans and package those loans and sell those loans to pension funds and mortgage-backed securities. And all this stuff isn't going away. We have something called the housing finance industry. It's what makes people's ability to buy properties, makes it a possibility. That's not going away. And if the compensation vehicle of MLS changes, it's not going to kill the housing market. It's going to force change in the housing market. And so you just want to be aware of it. You want to be able to talk about it. It's not coming tomorrow, but there are things you can do in the meantime. And like I said, it's learning how to and asking for the buyer broker contracts. So if you're not familiar with them, if you're in California, CAR creates a buyer broker contract. And so you want to make sure that you've got copies of that, you understand it, you get people to sign it. Now, when's the best time to get a buyer broker contract signed? For me, it's always been, I was telling Allison, when they passed the agency disclosure law in 1980, '88, I thought that was the perfect time to get buyer broker contracts. I thought it was so important that I created a tape set called How to List Buyers. You remember tapes? A tape set. Hey, cassettes. How to list buyers, because I thought this agency disclosure thing is going to get people. Here's an opportunity to get a buyer contract signed. You make your agency disclosure, you explain fiduciary duties, you explain how important it is to have a fiduciary representing you in a real estate transaction, and then you say, if you'd like to hire me to be your fiduciary, here's the way we do it. I use a buyer broker contract. Here's all the benefits of a buyer broker contract. Now, what agents would say was, if Jim Harrison doesn't use a buyer broker contract, I don't want to ask for one, because they're not going to want to deal with me, because I'm going to make them sign a contract and all the other agents aren't making them sign a buyer broker contract. So everybody was afraid. And so most people, now some states have made it mandatory, but most haven't. And so learn about the buyer broker contract. Learn how to present that buyer broker contract. Do it as soon as you can when you're working with somebody. And if you're working on the sell side, make sure that you document, that you explain to the seller that they don't have to offer compensation. That doesn't mean you can't tell them why it's important to offer compensation, but you got to make sure that they understand that they don't have to, and you'll limit your liability moving forward if you do that.